It's strange how ordinary nights can become the ones you never forget. I remember that evening clearly. The hum of fluorescent lights, the scent of antiseptic, and the sound of the ventilation system echoing softly through the corridors of St. Mary's Medical Center in Denver. It was 9:47 p.m., and I was preparing for what should have been another routine brain surgery. Nothing unusual. Nothing remarkable. My name is Dr. Alan Pierce, and I've been a neurosurgeon for over 20 years. I've operated on hundreds of brains, each one unique, each one a landscape of thought, memory, and mystery. But no operation, before or since, has ever left me questioning everything I know about consciousness, life, and what may lie beyond. That night, the patient was Emily Carter, a 42-year-old mother of two. A schoolteacher, warm smile, nervous laugh. She had been suffering from severe epileptic seizures caused by a benign tumor pressing against her left temporal lobe, dangerously close to the hippocampus, the part of the brain that forms memory. Removing it was delicate, but not unusual. I had done this procedure countless times. I remember greeting her before the operation. She looked at me and said, half joking, "You're the last person I'll see before I fall asleep." "That's a lot of trust, doctor." I smiled, reassured her, and told her she'd be fine. I meant it. At that point, there was no reason to think otherwise. In the operating room, everything was textbook perfect. The overhead surgical lights cast clean white circles across the sterile field. My team moved with quiet efficiency. Each instrument passed without a word, each motion rehearsed through years of practice. The anesthesiologist confirmed Emily was fully under. Her vitals were steady, heart rate normal, oxygen saturation ideal. As I adjusted the microscope and exposed the section of her brain where the tumor rested, I felt that familiar calm wash over me. Surgery, for me, has always been a place of order. It's where science and precision rule over chaos. A steady hand, a focused mind, and nothing else. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't explain it at first. Just a faint pressure, a heaviness in the room. The air felt thicker somehow, the silence deeper than usual. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter. A kind of unspoken tension, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Still, I pushed the feeling aside. The procedure demanded my full attention. The tumor was small, situated in a region that required precise navigation to avoid damaging critical tissue. Every millimeter mattered. I moved slowly, carefully, narrating my steps to the resident assisting me, exposing the hippocampal gyrus, now isolating the vascular branches. It was the kind of moment that defines the balance between human skill and the fragility of life. Inside that sterile circle of light, nothing existed but the work. Every heartbeat, every breath, every movement synchronized, but even within that rhythm, I couldn't shake the unease. Something was different about this case, something I couldn't yet name. The monitors hummed steadily, their green lines dancing across the black screens. Emily's brain activity was calm, consistent, the way it should be under full anesthesia. And yet, I remember glancing at her face, half covered by the drape, and feeling the strangest sensation that she wasn't entirely gone. It sounds irrational. Surgeons know better than to entertain intuition in the middle of an operation. But there it was. A sense that somewhere behind the silence, she was still there. Watching, waiting, listening. I took a breath, steadied my hands, and continued. The scalpel glinted under the surgical lights. The suction whispered softly beside the steady rhythm of the EKG. To anyone watching, it was a perfect surgery. Calm, controlled, clinical. But deep inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the precision, something unknown was about to reveal itself. And then, the first anomaly appeared. It started as a flicker, the kind of irregularity you'd normally ignore. The EEG monitor, which tracks electrical activity in the brain, showed a small surge. Nothing major. At first, I assumed it was interference, maybe static from a nearby instrument or a movement artifact from the ventilator. But then it happened again. Stronger, sharper. Emily's vital signs were stable, heart rate perfect, oxygen levels flawless, anesthesia steady. Yet her brain activity was telling a very different story. There were sudden, rhythmic spikes. Not the slow waves you expect from a patient under deep anesthesia, but fast, complex bursts that looked conscious. "Check the leads," I said quietly. The anesthesiologist leaned forward, frowning at the screen. He unplugged and reattached each electrode one by one. No change. The readings held steady, pulsing with the same impossible rhythm. I've spent my entire career interpreting brain activity. The human brain speaks in electrical language, and after years of surgery, I could read it like a musician reads sheet music. But this pattern, this intensity was something else entirely. Looked like she was awake. Could it be a glitch? My resident whispered. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But every piece of equipment in that room had passed calibration that morning. There was no malfunction, no technical excuse. The data was real. I remember leaning closer to the monitor, tracing the peaks with my eyes. They were sharp and deliberate, almost rhythmic. It was as though her brain were responding to something, or someone. "Emily, can you hear me?" I said it, half jokingly, out of habit more than belief. The words barely left my lips when the EEG responded. The spikes increased, rising in synchrony with the cadence of my voice. The room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The anesthesiologist looked at me, eyes wide. "That's not possible," he muttered. I said nothing. I didn't trust my own voice. I tried again, slower this time. "Emily, if you can hear me, just stay calm. You're safe." And again, the monitor reacted. The same pattern, the same rise and fall aligned perfectly with each word I spoke. I felt a cold pulse crawl up my spine. We all knew it was impossible. A patient under this level of anesthesia should be completely unresponsive. The cortex, the part of the brain responsible for awareness, should be quiet. Yet what I was seeing was awareness. Intentional, intelligent awareness. My hands hovered above her skull, frozen mid-motion. The sterile field around me seemed to shrink. The hum of the machines louder now, each beep amplified into something almost accusatory. My surgical mask hid my face, but inside I was trembling. I asked the anesthesiologist to check her depth again. The readings were ideal. She was deeply under. Physically, she was asleep. Neurologically, she shouldn't even be capable of dreaming. And yet her brain was listening. No one in the room spoke after that. We continued the procedure in complete silence. The only sound was the beeping of the monitors, and beneath it, the faint hum of the ventilation system. But the rhythm of that EEG stayed with me, pulsing gently in time with the sound of my voice and memory. A kind of echo, living in the static. And in that moment, one truth settled deep inside me. Something I've never been able to forget. We were not alone in that room. I told myself to focus, to stay in control. The anomaly on the monitor couldn't change what needed to be done. The tumor was there, pressing against her hippocampus, and it had to come out. I steadied my hands, returning to the rhythm I'd trained my whole life to maintain. Precision, focus, detachment. But even as I worked, that creeping sense of wrongness stayed in the room, clinging to the air like static. For a while, things seemed normal again. Every move was measured, every response predictable. The readings steadied. The hum of the machines fell back into their familiar cadence. I almost convinced myself it had been a coincidence. But then, something changed. It started with a subtle twitch in Emily's left hand. Barely noticeable, but enough to catch my eye. A flicker of movement beneath the surgical drape. I paused, knife hovering in the air. Reflexes during surgery aren't unheard of, especially when nerves are being stimulated. But this wasn't a random spasm. It was deliberate. A slow curling motion of her fingers, like someone trying to grasp something. The anesthesiologist checked her vitals immediately. "No change," he said, his voice unsteady. "She's still fully under." I tried to reason through it. Perhaps a stray electrical signal, a motor response triggered by nearby neural tissue. Science offered a dozen explanations. And yet, deep down, I felt the truth. This was not reflex. And then she spoke. The sound was faint, almost fragile. A breath escaping through lips that should have been paralyzed. "Don't stop talking," I froze. My mind refused to process what I just heard. The nurses exchanged glances, their faces pale behind their masks. Did she just... One of them began, but her words trailed off. Her eyes were still closed. Her body completely still. Every machine in that room screamed unconsciousness. But her voice was awake. I leaned closer, my hands shaking. "Emily?" I whispered. "Can you hear me?" No response this time, just the soft rhythm of her breathing and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. But the air had changed, thicker somehow, charged with something I couldn't explain. And then the monitor flatlined. The sound cut through the room like a blade, one long, endless tone. My stomach dropped. I called for epinephrine, for compressions, for every emergency protocol I'd ever drilled into my team. But before anyone could move, the line came back. A sudden burst of activity, wild and chaotic, unlike anything I had ever seen. The EEG lit up with overlapping waves, not one pattern, but two. Two separate rhythms, colliding and merging, dancing together in some impossible synchronization. One sharp and ordered, the other slow and pulsing, almost sentient. For those few seconds, the room didn't feel like an operating theater anymore. It felt like a crossing. A place where something else had brushed against us, just long enough to make itself known. When it was over, I stood there, staring at her motionless face. The monitors had stabilized again, but the silence that followed was deafening. Later, when I reviewed the footage, the audio picked up her whisper clearer than I remembered. "Don't stop talking." The voice trembled, pleading, not in pain, but as if she was lost somewhere between worlds and needed a guide. That was the moment I realized. For all our mastery of the brain, for all our knowledge of consciousness, there are still places inside the human mind that medicine cannot reach. And that night, we had just stepped into one of them. Emily survived. The surgery was, by every measurable standard, a success. The tumor was fully removed, her vitals had stabilized, and by the following morning she was awake. But the sense of relief that usually came after a case like this never arrived. Something lingered, something I couldn't name. When I first entered her recovery room, Sunlight was spilling across the sheets, washing the sterile white walls in gold. She looked peaceful, calm, almost radiant. Her vitals were perfect. But when she turned her head and met my eyes, the words she spoke drained every trace of warmth from that room. Who was the man talking to me during the surgery? For a moment I couldn't speak. My mind scrambled to catch up. What do you mean? I asked carefully. She frowned as though trying to recall a dream. There was a man's voice. Not yours, deeper. He said, don't be afraid. You're not done yet. The world seemed to tilt. I remember my throat going dry. During that entire operation, the only voices were mine and the anesthesiologist's, both recorded on the surgical log. No one else spoke. Certainly not. Whoever she was describing. She went on to describe details no patient should ever remember. The rhythmic hum of the ventilator, the faint hiss of the suction, even the shape of the retractor I used, a model we'd only begun using a week earlier. She shouldn't have been capable of forming a single new memory under that level of anesthesia. Yet here she was, recounting it like she'd been awake the whole time, from somewhere far beyond her body. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is. I consulted anesthesiologists, neurologists, even a neuropsychologist specializing in memory formation. Every one of them said the same thing. It's impossible. The drugs we'd used, the dosage levels, the EEG readings, all confirmed she was completely unconscious. But as the days passed, more strange details emerged. During one follow-up exam, I caught her staring at the surgical scar along her temple. She traced it lightly with her finger and said, almost absent-mindedly, "You hesitated here." She was right, I had. Only for a few seconds. A pause so subtle only I could have known it happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office replaying the surgery footage again and again, listening to the faint echo of her voice through the static. Each time that same question echoed louder in my head. Who was the man she heard? Science had no place for voices that crossed the threshold of anesthesia. But medicine, I was beginning to realize, doesn't always tell the full story. Something had reached her. Through the stillness, through the unconscious, through the dark. And for the first time in my career, I didn't know if I was more fascinated or afraid. In the weeks that followed, the hospital moved on. Emily's case was filed away as another successful surgery. Complication-free, textbook perfect. But I couldn't move on. Something about her words clung to me like static. That voice. That impossible recollection. The way her brain had responded during anesthesia. It all refused to leave me in peace. Most surgeons learn to separate emotion from logic. We have to. It's the only way to survive this work. But this wasn't emotion. It was something deeper. A fracture in the foundation of everything I thought I understood. I began spending my nights in the research lab after my shifts ended. The hospital halls at 2 a.m. are a different world. Quiet, hollow, almost sacred. You can hear the low hum of the refrigeration units from the pathology wing, the distant hiss of oxygen tanks, the flicker of fluorescent lights that no one's bothered to replace. I sat there alone, watching the EEG recordings from Emily's surgery frame by frame, searching for meaning in the noise. That's when I noticed it. A pattern, faint but unmistakable. The electrical spikes in her temporal lobe weren't random. They rose and fell rhythmically, almost like speech. The cadence matched my own voice during the procedure. When I spoke, her brain responded. When I paused, it rested. It wasn't coincidence. It was synchronization. I stared at the monitor for hours, listening to the faint playback of my own words overlapping the EEG graph. It was as if her mind, whatever part of it still existed under the anesthesia, had been listening, engaging. I started interviewing Emily weekly under the guise of post-op follow-ups. She was happy, healthy, and increasingly curious about what had happened. She said that during the operation, she'd felt herself floating, watching the procedure from somewhere above. She described the sound of my voice, calm, steady, guiding her through the dark. But then she mentioned something else. There was another voice, she said softly. Not human, or maybe it was, but it sounded far away. It told me, "You're not done yet." My chest tightened. That same phrase, she had said it before, right after waking up. "You're not done yet." I tried to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of the anesthetic. But something about her conviction, her clarity, it felt too deliberate. I began combing through old surgical records. 3 previous patients had undergone temporal lobe operations in that same operating room. 2 had died from unrelated complications. But one, a man named Richard Keller, had woken from surgery describing something eerily similar. A voice that told him, "You have to go back." He died 3 weeks later of a heart attack in his sleep. Coincidence, I told myself. It had to be. But logic was no longer enough. Every answer I found only deepened the question. Nurses started noticing the hours I was keeping. One of them, Marissa, stopped me one night and said, "Dr. Pierce, you look like you've seen a ghost." Maybe I had. Because every time I replayed Emily's EEG, every time I saw those pulses align perfectly with my words, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just reading brain activity. I was watching consciousness itself, reaching out. Months passed, but the questions only grew louder. I'd filled 3 notebooks with data, sketches of waveforms and half-formed theories about language synchronization and consciousness retention. It wasn't science anymore. It was obsession. Then, one night, while preparing for a neurology conference in Chicago, I decided to run one final comparison. I opened Emily's EEG data from the surgery and overlaid it with a clean recording of my own voice from that same day. I adjusted the timing, lined up the spikes, and froze. Every word I had spoken matched the electrical rhythms in her brain. Every syllable, every pause, every breath. Her mind, unconscious and under full anesthesia, had somehow mirrored my voice. For several minutes, I just stared at the screen, unable to move. The rational part of me screamed that it was a coincidence, that noise patterns could imitate rhythm. But deep down, I knew better. This was intentional, responsive, almost aware. The next day, I presented my findings at the conference. It wasn't supposed to be a headline, just a small case study about anomalous intraoperative neural activity. But as soon as I showed the overlay, my voice's waveform dancing in perfect synchrony with Emily's brain activity, the room fell silent. I remember scanning the faces of the neurologists and anesthesiologists in the audience. At first, disbelief, then discomfort, and finally, fear. One older researcher approached me afterward. His name was Dr. Leon Reddick, a pioneer in neural imaging. He looked around to make sure no one was listening and said quietly, "You're not the first to see this." He told me about a handful of surgeons across the country who'd reported similar phenomena. Synchronized neural responses, auditory mirroring, consciousness signatures that appeared long after patients were fully anesthetized. But every one of them buried their findings. "We're not ready for what this means," he said. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Emily's voice in my head. "You're not done yet." I opened her file again and stared at the final EEG printout. The lines on the paper weren't static anymore. My mind filled in the motion, waves pulsing, alive, as though something inside them was trying to speak. I reached out and traced one of the repeating sequences. 3 sharp spikes followed by a long plateau. It almost looked like a word. Not written in letters, but in rhythm. Later, back at St. Mary's, I ran a digital analysis on that exact section. The software translated the waveform into a sonification, converting it back into sound. I hit play. For a moment, there was only static. Then faintly, a whisper. "Alan." I stopped the playback immediately, my hands shaking. Rationally, I knew it had to be an artifact, a distortion, a random alignment to frequency noise. But the voice was clear. Human, female, and it said my name. Since that night, I've never been able to listen to that recording again. But sometimes, when the hospital's quiet and I'm alone in the OR, I swear I can hear something faint under the hum of the monitors. A rhythm, a pulse, like a patient still trying to speak. It's been years since that night. Since Emily's surgery, the data, the whisper. But there isn't a week that goes by when I don't think about it. Sometimes, in the early mornings before rounds, I'll sit in my office, open her file, and stare at the still images of her EEG. The ink has faded slightly over time, but the rhythm, those repeating pulses, still seem alive. I've replayed every detail of that surgery in my head 1,000 times. The instruments, the lighting, the sterile air, everything was by the book, and yet something happened that no textbook, no peer-reviewed journal can explain. For most of my career, I believed the brain was consciousness, that every thought, emotion, and memory was just electrical activity. But what I witnessed that night made me question everything. If a brain under anesthesia, disconnected from awareness, can mirror a voice, can remember it afterward, then maybe consciousness isn't just generated by neurons. Maybe it's something that uses them, something that continues even when we think it stops. A few months after the conference, I visited Emily at her home. She had recovered completely. No seizures, no neurological deficits. She looked vibrant, full of life. When she opened the door, she smiled like she'd been expecting me. We sat in her kitchen, sunlight spilling through the window. For a moment, it felt ordinary. 2 people discussing a successful surgery. But then she looked at me and said softly, "I remember your voice. You were calm, but scared." I froze. She wasn't supposed to remember anything. Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "When you stopped talking," she added, "I heard someone else, a man. He said, 'You'll understand someday.'" I didn't know how to respond. There was no explanation, not one that fit within the rules I'd lived by my entire career. I thanked her, told her to take care of herself, and left. That was the last time I saw Emily. She sent me a Christmas card the following year, a picture of her with her husband and children smiling. On the back, in small handwriting, she'd written, "Still listening." Now, whenever I walk past the OR where that surgery took place, I pause for a moment. The same hum of machines, the same sterile scent of antiseptic and metal. But sometimes, when it's quiet enough, I swear I can feel something watching. Not with eyes, but with awareness. I used to think of consciousness as a spark that ends when the body fails. Now, I think of it more like a signal, one that might persist, flickering just beyond what our instruments can detect. And maybe we've only mapped the surface. As dawn breaks outside St. Mary's, I stand by the hospital doors, watching the first light spill across the parking lot. The world wakes, routines begin, but for me, something remains suspended in that single moment, the whisper that changed everything. Maybe the brain isn't where consciousness begins. Maybe it's simply where it passes through.